Background of the speaker: Professor Hilary I. Inyang. Hilary I. Inyang, a visiting international research fellow of the Africa Institute of South Africa, ISA, is a world-renowned researcher, expeditionist and educator in the areas of environmental science and engineering, geohazards, energy systems and international development. He is a member of the Education Caucus of the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development and served for 2 terms, 1997 to 2001, as chair of the Science Advisory Board, Engineering Committee, of US EPA in Washington, D.C., USA. He is a former Duke Energy Distinguished Professor and Director of the Global Institute of Energy and Environmental Systems of the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, USA. Former DuPont Professor of Environmental Engineering and Science and Director of CEEST, University of Massachusetts, Lowell, USA. Former President of the African University of Science and Technology, Abuja, Nigeria, and former Vice-Chancellor of the Botswana International University of Science and Technology. He chaired the steering committee of the Africa Science Plans under the auspices of the International Council for Science, UNESCO and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Currently, he is a UNESCO consultant on water security and visiting professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, IITB, Mumbai, India. He has authored several research proposals and won research grants from several agencies including the U.S. National Research Foundation, Sandia National Laboratories, USA, General Electric Corporation, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the African Development Bank. He has won more than 20 professional prizes and is a former AAAS, US EPA Environmental Science and Engineering Fellow, U.S. National Research Council Young Investigator and Eisenhower, Randolph Fellow. He has authored about 275 publications and served on 29 journal editorial boards. He won the 2013 Nigerian National Order of Merit, NNOM, in Science and Technology and is a Fellow of both the African Academy of Science and the Geological Society of London. He is also a Proust poet.
Professor deserves to take this lecture. So I'll just invite Professor Hilary Inyang to take over and give us this lecture on climate change, induced hazards, and framing of adaptation systems in developing countries. You're welcome, Professor Inyang.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Koki. I'm very happy to be given the opportunity to talk to you today. And I applaud the efforts of your organization, that is the Daily newspaper, and Spaces for Change, and Oil and Gas Service Providers Association of Nigeria. I have to thank you for taking leadership to organize this very important forum on a very important topic too, that has a lot of implications on the socio-economic development of Nigeria and many other developing countries. I know that there are many people online watching this, and I would then like to say how this lecture will proceed. And I hope all of you can hear me. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just proceed by saying that this lecture is divided into segments. The first part of the lecture is actually to indicate the significance of global climate change to economic development of developing countries, and by extension, developed countries too. And then we'll look at what is really climate change. And I'm sure that viewing this are some scientists, but there are other people who are just policymakers and may not be very deep in the understanding of the mechanics of global climate change. That is from the scientific aspect, although it may be very deep in the policy aspect. So we'll look at that. Then we'll look at the phenomena of global climate change and how it impacts upon many Earth system processes worldwide. So when you hear flooding, why do we have floods? Why should it matter? Erosion, ecological changes, and all those things we'll look at today. And finally, we'll look at how developing countries can adapt to global climate change impacts. So this is how we are going to proceed. So without much ado, we will load up now and proceed. The presentation is on now. Please allow us in on the presentation.
Yes,
okay.
You should be able to do that,
okay.
sir.
You can see now that so the topic is climate change induced hazards and framing of adaptation systems in developing countries. So we'll just proceed section by section. Global climate change within the context of socio-economic development of countries. That's what we'll treat right now. Now, the global community has developed a number of initiatives, usually some set at many decades from now. The most important one that we are all aware of is the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs 2030. SDGs 2030. And in addition to that, we have many regional development initiatives that are at the continental level. Africa has its own, Africa Agenda 2063. There are international trade agreements, and basically every developing country, even the advanced countries too, the technologically advanced countries also have national economic development plans. They are typically 5-year plans. And then you have green development agreements of countries, and there are some bilateral and multilateral agreements. All of these agreements, national and continental and global development targets, are affected by global climate change. The prospects for these countries with respect to economic well-being and the elevation of the standard of living of their people are all affected now and will continue to be affected by global climate change. Now, let's see. Okay. Generally, we should look at socio-economic development, basically the sustainable development, to be made up of 4 important pillars: economic development, population management, environmental and natural resource stewardship, and social equity. All of these 4 pillars have implications on various economic sectors. You see, on the right-hand side, we have agriculture, industrial sector, energy. The impact of global climate change on sustainable development, it's more of a compilation or a composite of the impacts of global climate change on each of these economic development sectors, in agriculture, in energy, and so forth. So this is why this is able to percolate through the economy. The impacts of global climate change percolates through the economy of countries because it has impacts on each of these separate sectors. The developing countries are in a dilemma. They must seek energy sources, and the most abundant energy sources are hydrocarbons. So they must burn hydrocarbons in order to improve their economies, to provide jobs and services for their citizens. Unfortunately, there is a correlation between burning hydrocarbons and CO2 emissions and impact on global climate change. So look at the countries that we used to call and still call the Asian tiger countries. Bangladesh, China is out of it now. It's actually a very well developed country. Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, Nigeria is in this class, although we don't have Nigerian data here. If you look at the population in poverty, Bangladesh, about 45% in poverty. Life expectancy is somewhat low, about 59 or so. Then percent industrial growth is just modest. Energy consumption very low. So GDP growth rates, okay, is very somewhat medium. CO2 emissions, not much. But any country that has taken a lot of its population out of poverty has done so by economic development, often through burning of carbon. And let's look at Republic of Korea there in the middle. You see that the energy consumption is very high, and carbon emissions is very high too. So that's the dilemma that developing countries face. In order to industrialize and provide goods and services for their population, they have to burn coal. They have to burn oil, unfortunately. And what is happening is that the emissions, which is still a small percentage of what the technologically advanced countries have burnt, but we cannot encourage burning of coal and oil in developing countries just because the developed countries did it. So we have to look for alternative sources of energy. But our focus today is global climate change, and it is these kinds of things that have happened in the past, especially after the Industrial Revolution. A lot of combustion of fossil fuels. Like you see here, this picture I took during my trip to China some years ago. You see the burning of hydrocarbons, emissions into the atmosphere. This is another one, which is from a cement factory. This is a problem in Nigeria. So all of these are contributors to global climate change. Now, what is global climate change and how is it zoned really? I will not delve into this in great detail because it would take entire time for the lecture. But it is very important to look at the essential elements for understanding so we know where to intervene. Basically, you know that there is a process called the greenhouse effect, the mechanism in which visible light comes from the sun and then passes through layers in the atmosphere, layers of gases in the atmosphere. So it hits the ground surface. And then when it hits the ground surface, some of that is sent back into the atmosphere. But unfortunately, some gases that are in the atmosphere refracts that and absorbs some, and leaving only infrared radiation to go back. So it is the warming effect of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that is responsible for entrapment of heat and then making the temperature rise over time. So essentially, that is the process of global climate change that I have shown here. So over time, that increase in temperature affects many Earth system processes. And these processes, unfortunately, are uneven. In some places, there will be positive effects. In other places, there will be negative effects. So let's take a look then at what these gases are. The principal gases that are responsible for warming of the atmosphere are carbon dioxide. Its global warming potential is 1. We can grade that as 1. Methane, its global warming potential is 25. Nitrous oxide, it is 298. Hydrofluorocarbons, a lot of those come from burning even some fridges, furans, perfluorocarbons, hexafluoride. So all these compounds go into the atmosphere and have very high global warming potential. So it is not that just the potential alone is a determinant. The abundance of that gas also in the atmosphere has effect. For example, although carbon dioxide has a warming potential of just 1, but it is much more abundant than the others. So the net effect is that if you control carbon dioxide, although it has a global warming potential that is low, but that is overtaken, negated by the high abundance of carbon dioxide because of combustion of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, be they in refineries, cement factories, other kinds of factories, vehicles, some kinds of farming, and so forth and so forth. So these gases are responsible. Now, where do these gases come from? In a natural operation as what I would call human activities on Earth. Road transport generates a lot. Generates a lot of this. Enteric fermentation, gas production, rice cultivation, coal production, human wastewater disposal, landfills, because decay processes in waste landfills also lead to emission of carbon into the atmosphere. Animal waste, residential biofuel combustion. Long-lived ones only, power generation is one that is implicated. Electric power generation by burning coal. This is not by solar, by burning coal. Industrial combustion processes, road transport, those big buses and vehicles that passenger vehicles that release fumes into the atmosphere, deforestation, crop production, animal waste. So you see that these are all normal anthropogenic activities. And a lot of these anthropogenic activities are responsible for spewing those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and in turn causing global climate change to accelerate. Now, I mentioned that the principal mechanism by which the climate warms is essentially temperature is an index of heat. So if you look at the data from 1995 to 2004, that's much earlier than now. The mean temperature, air temperature over the continent is what is shown there. Wherever you see colors that are orange or approach orange from yellow, it means there has been an increase. And the darker the color, the greater the increase in temperature that has been recorded over that time period. You see, look at East Africa there. Look at Asia, the northern reaches of Russia. Look at North America, Canada, Greenland, and all those outlying areas. Look at the southern hemisphere. You can see that there are some places even over the ocean. So it is no longer something that is debatable. Global temperatures have risen over time and has been responsible for the global climate change that we experience today and will continue to experience in the future. Now, there's a lot more of this, and there are some projections of what the climate is likely to be from 240 to 2060, 2040 to 2060. That's what you have there. You see West Africa where you are today, what is likely to happen. As I say again, the darker the color, the more intense the effect. You see areas around India, areas around China, and some parts of North America and South America. If you extend it even longer to 2080 to 2100, it's going to be even warmer using predictions, mathematical expressions that are used for predictions. So global climate change is likely to stay with us for a very long time, beyond, much beyond our era of existence. Now, in Africa, one of the things that we always also treat along global climate change, not just in Africa, in other parts of the world as well, is sea level rise, because that is also tied to global climate change, the melting of ice in polar regions. Obviously, if the temperature increases, you are going to have melting of ice, and all of that melting will come into the world's oceans, implying that sea level rise will be the case. And that has been experienced even in Nigeria, Lagos, the Niger Delta, other parts of West Africa, as you can see here. There has been significant sea level rise. As you see there, as the color goes darker, so does the rise in sea level. Small rises in sea level can have significant implications on coastal flooding and many other processes that are responsible for maintaining the health of coastal regions of the world. But we will treat this thing in a more systematic way very soon. Let us scale global climate change impacts as the next section. There are some challenges in addressing global climate change, and indeed any type of environmental change that results from human action or even non-human action. And I have classified them this way. We have the problem of attribution. In other words, things that happen now may not necessarily have the impacts now. The impacts are displaced in time forward. The implication of that is that it may be then very difficult to trace back the the impacts to the effects, right? To trace back the causes to the impacts. This is what we call the problem of attribution. In other words, things may happen now and it doesn't seem that they have impacts because the impacts will come much, much later. And for somebody who tries to connect impacts to the instigating events, that can be very difficult, especially when there are interplay of so many factors along the way. The second thing is that some environmental perturbations have impacts that extend beyond their locations. In other words, something may have happened in the Republic of Benin, but the impacts are felt in Kenya. Something may have happened in West Africa, but the impacts concentrate in North America. This is the nature of environmental phenomena. So although most of the coal burning over time, especially in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, happened in the developed countries, Europe in particular, but the impacts are felt by everybody. Developing countries are also challenged by the impacts of global climate change, although they have been minor contributors to the carbon budget, the carbon amounts in the atmosphere over time. There is the challenge of acute and chronic impacts. Some impacts are very transient. They go away over a short time. The other impacts extend, are chronic, so they go over a long time. Some impacts may not reach thresholds for detection. Remember that in order to call something an impact, we have to be able to detect with the instruments that we have. Either there is a very, very aggressive impact that we can observe, like an earthquake, like a flood, like any of these things. But other kinds of impacts are more sensitive. They can only be picked up by very sensitive instrumentation. So that is also a challenge. Humans also respond in a way that are impacted by sociological factors as well. Now, let me skip the mathematics because I want to get to some things that are more direct and appreciated by the entire audience, not mathematicians alone. The next thing I would like to indicate is that impacts can also be very interactive. For example, if global climate change impacts are recorded in the water resources area, you can percolate to biodiversity, you can percolate to food security. For example, if you have droughts, like we typically have in the Sahel part of West Africa, the savanna zone that extends to the desert, the Sahara Desert Fringe, it can impact upon the biodiversity of that region. It can also impact upon food security, and it can impact upon even crisis, sociological crisis, conflicts between farmers and herders because the grass has waned off due to global climate change. So impacts are so interactive. Rainfall generating processes can be impacted, and rainfall can transfer sediments from hinterland areas into coastal areas and dump in the ocean, and then affect the livelihoods of fishermen. So these kinds of interactions are very common. That is why global climate change is so profound in both its processes and the impacts that it generates. Now, in showing you all of these impacts I'm going to show in a few moments, it is very important to note these kinds of connections that are in compartments. So typically, you will have an extreme event that may be caused by global climate change, say floods, and then that flood releases contaminants and so forth into the environment or impacts the environment in some other way. Well, the environment itself will then impose impacts in two main sectors. That's the human health system is one, and we typically call the means by which that happens exposure pathways. And then the other one is ecological. So we should always look at impacts on the environment in terms of the ecology of the place and also in terms of the human health. This is why every environmental management agency in the world is set up to treat both. That is human health and the environment. We typically hear that phrase a lot. So all of these impacts that I'm going to show you pictorially and otherwise are formatted in this way. Now, let's look at global climate change impacts, how I categorize them. So when some of you who are policymakers and all of you, some of you are students and some of you are professors would like to categorize these impacts. You may have your own way, but this is my own way. Typically, there are 4 processes in dealing with impacts. You have to identify the impact. In some cases, you have to predict the impact from what you've identified. What are the ramifications of what you have measured? Okay, then the third is, what is the significance of this? Some impacts are insignificant and can be ignored, while others are profound, cannot be easily ignored. Then thirdly, then you have to think about how do we impact the impact? In other words, how do we institute control measures to limit the negative effects of the impacts or magnify the positive effects of the impact? This lecture, of course, is titled Impact Adaptation. We can also mitigate impacts, but we are not focused today on impact mitigation. Mitigation is to do something to prevent it. Adaptation is to do something to adjust behavior and adjust circumstances so that you can tolerate the impact much more. So we are concerned in this lecture not with mitigation, but with adaptation. Mitigation is sometimes more expensive than adaptation because it typically involves changing of industrial processes, changing of energy systems, changing of a lot of regulations that impact upon development, whereas impact controls in terms of adaptation are downstream. You do something to absorb the impact a little bit easier, more cost effectively. And this is where developing countries can start because they may not have much of the resources necessary to embark on massive mitigation. Now, I also show impacts this way. I like to classify some impacts as those that are direct. Those are the primary impacts. And then there are other indirect impacts that will come from those ones. For example, if we have a situation in which rainfall increases intensity, we are likely to have floods. And from floods, we are going to have destruction of culverts, bridges, streets, and so forth. So those ones are indirect. We can also have drought. Drought can lead to domestic and economic water scarcity. So these impacts are cascading. From one impact, it multiplies to other impacts and keeps cascading like that. So some of the most common ones in this part of the world is increase in seasonality of rainfall. For example, in Nigeria, rainfall used to be spread out, the rainy season. Now the rainy season is more concentrated, but it has been realized that the same level of total amount of precipitation is still the case, but it's just been constrained to a shorter season, meaning that the rainfall intensity is much higher. It therefore leads to more flooding. See, there's also drought in some parts of the country and some parts of West Africa, in some parts of developing countries. Coastal erosion has been experienced. Windstorms and sandstorms are common, not only in West Africa, the Sahel, but in the Kalahari and other places, the Gobi Desert, okay, and the Atacama Desert in South America, because we are talking about developing countries. There are many developing countries in South America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia. So all of these have experienced this depending on their geographical location and some of the socio-ecological factors that are prevalent in those places. But these are some of the ones I will illustrate so you see these processes. First, let's look at ecological impacts. What are the ecological impacts of global climate change? We will look at them this way. First, there are impacts at the individual organism level. Okay, So you may have some organisms in a system, in the ecology of a place, so you can have reduced growth and altered development, reduced reproduction and high mortality of those organisms that are more susceptible. Why should that be the case? That will be the case because some organisms may thrive well in particular temperature regimes and in particular humidity regimes, in particular rainfall regimes. Now that that has been altered through global climate change, so there will be impact. Some of them will die off, some of them will take other parts to evolution. Then the other one is impacts on floral and faunal populations. That's reduction in population, and in some places you may even have increase in population, depending on the physiological makeup of those kinds of organisms and the physiological makeup of those kinds of fauna and flora. Impacts on ecosystem as a whole. The ecosystem may no longer be able to provide the function. Let me give you an example. The function of the mangrove, say of West Africa, is that a lot of fishes, different kinds of fish are there. So they provide occupation for fishermen. Supposing you have global climate change changing all of that, and a lot of the fishes that are there, a big fraction will die off, it will have impact on the economic livelihood of the fishermen in those sectors of the continent. And this is the case in West Africa, this is the case in East Africa, this is the case in many parts of the world. This is the case in the Nile Delta, this is the case in many other deltas, the Ganges Delta in India, and many other parts of the world. So these are the ecological changes. One of the other factors in ecological change is what I've just shown you now. You see, there are extreme weather events. Global climate change can cause extreme weather events. What are extreme weather events? You can have hurricanes, you can have windstorms, you can have floods, you can have those kinds of things that are hydrological, extreme weather events. But what happens is that when you have these extreme weather events, and you are likely to have wash off of certain kinds of contaminants, be they viruses like cholera, be they encephalitis. So typically, there are some ailments that are associated with extreme weather events. This map that you are seeing is one that was recorded by some researchers, and I think it was published in Science. See those areas that you have red color. You find Nigeria, you find Guyana there, you have Venezuela in South America, you have Ethiopia, you have Kenya there, you have some parts of India, Indochina. So these are areas that they have recorded a lot of diseases because of extreme weather events from June 1997 to May 1998. You see how weather can influence susceptibility to diseases in different places. I'm sure that a lot of you who are Nigerian listening, and a lot of you are Africans also listening from different places, you can relate to that. You know that flood water sometimes carry viruses, carry bacteria, and increase the prospects of exposure of individuals to them. Now, what I've just shown you there is what I would call the malaria belt of the world, that is painted with purple. That's the malaria belt of the world. Unfortunately, this malaria belt of the world is now changing. Why? Because global warming has now increased the prospects for the migration of malaria and other kinds of pathogens to different places. For example, I was a researcher in Ethiopia until recently. We found out that malaria mosquitoes, Anopheles mosquitoes, are now able to move up into hilly areas that they never existed before, because global warming has changed the temperature regime and the spatio-temporal spread of temperatures across that region. So this is what is happening. Global climate change has favored the existence or the growth of certain pathogens in certain areas, and it's not always negative. In some cases, it has also made certain pathogens to die off in other areas that are not favored by global climate change. But the net effect has been negative, unfortunately. So that malaria belt that I'm just showing you now is likely to expand to other areas that become wetter and hotter as a result of global climate change. Now, using the case of Nigeria, one of the impacts of global climate change is to change the spatial-temporal distribution of vegetation. Places that were forested before are now spaced. You may know that the margin of the Sahara has been basically moving downwards in West Africa by about 1.5 kilometers per year because of drought conditions occasioned by global climate change. Even isolating Nigeria using that map I've shown you there, those are the various ecological zones of Nigeria, or vegetation zones of Nigeria. One of the reasons, believe it or not, for conflicts in the middle belt of Nigeria is that headers from the far north, who now have space vegetation where they have been, have to move south to look for greenery. And that conflicts with the occupation of people who have been more sedentary farmers. So they have to struggle for the same resources that have been laid bare by land. The Lake Chad, which was a very big lake about 20 years ago, has now shrunk. And in most parts, you have exposed sediments. So these are things that will continue to intensify as a result of global climate change, and it will lead to natural resource conflicts in many developing parts of the world. We've already had those in Southern Africa. We've already had those in West Africa. We already had those in Southeast Asia and in South America. They are bound to continue. Now, what about global climate change impacts on water resources? Where you have seen that are marked blue, these are the what I will call coastal waters around every continent worldwide. Much of the fishing in this world, much of the fishing is restricted to those continental shelves. Okay? Those continental shelves, be there in West African shelf, be there in East Africa, and you see even Japan, Australia, and all that. Much of fishing, of course, in those places. Unfortunately, what is happening is that a lot of erosion on land is now being transferring sediments and a lot of contaminants. And these contaminants come from industrial activities, domestic activities, and municipal activities, taking them into the oceans, meaning that you have contamination of fishes, you have a lot of deleterious circumstances, and climate change is exacerbating this, promoting a lot of this. Okay, when you have a big flood, the Niger River is going to transfer a lot of sediments. The River Nile will do the same. The River Mississippi in North America is going to transfer a lot of sediments with PCBs and many other things that are washed off land into the Gulf of Mexico that you see there. If I had a pointer, I would show you. But the Gulf of Mexico right there, and the Bight of Biafra in Africa, and other gulfs elsewhere. So this is one of the things that has happened as a result of global climate change. Pollution of the continental shelves will diminish fish catches and generate occupational losses with associated socioeconomic problems in coastal areas of Nigeria and many other similar coastal areas worldwide. I just decided to show this picture that I took from the Niger Delta some years ago. You see what I mean? Pollution, a lot of these kinds of places are habitat for fish. Any negative influence on these kinds of places, be there oil pollution, wash off of oil by floods into this kind of environment is likely to be deleterious to fishing. This is another example of wash off into ecologically sensitive areas that will cause damages, cause communal conflicts worldwide. Another impact of global climate change is what we call seawater intrusion. Seawater is salty and thus has greater density than water that is inside the soil. That's normal subterranean upland. So if you look at the right-hand side of this, this is the sea. If you look at the left-hand side, that is land. As you know, we have something called the Dedos zone. That is the distance between the ground surface and the water table. See, the water table is that thing where gray starts with some sort of inverted triangle that we put there. So the water table sits there under normal circumstances because of the gradient. Water sips in the soil towards the ocean. But that will be distorted in a situation in which the seawater becomes more saline. If you put water in a basin and you put oil and you put salt water in a basin and expose that salt water to the air where it is very sunny with heat, what will happen is that the concentration of the salt in that salty water will continue to increase and increase and increase because water is evaporating and concentrating the salt. That happens in the ocean too. So if you have oceanic temperatures above the ocean temperatures that are high, the ocean salts will concentrate so that the density of concentrated salt in water will be higher, and then it will affect the dynamics. So rather than the water flowing from the land on the ground into the ocean, it will now flow from the sea on the ground, so that in those coastal areas where you have cities and people have boreholes, they are likely to get salt water from their boreholes, no longer the clean water they will get from those boreholes. This is an indirect impact of global climate change in some parts of the world. And I tell you that this will happen in places like Lagos, Accra, and those coastal cities around West Africa, and even those around East Africa as well, Mombasa, Durban in South Africa, and other cities in Southeast Asia that are on the coastal fringe. Now, I would also like to show you the map of runoff from stream flow records from 1948 to 2004. These will change dramatically as a result of global climate change. Some places will dry up, some places will flood up, but I'm not going to spend time today because that would certainly be a full lecture on its own. But suffice it to note that the runoff patterns in the world will change. Some rivers will dry up, some rivers will increase in intensity of flow as a result of global climate change. And this will impact the availability of surface water for industrial processes and domestic use in many parts of the world. What about groundwater? What you are looking at is the groundwater map of the world. Where you see blue means that the groundwater is readily available or accessible. That's the word to use, accessible. That is, if you dig the ground within a few meters, you may get to groundwater. But in other areas that you see there that are either white or gray or pink, it is not so easy to get to groundwater. Those of you who are in Nigeria can note that Abuja is there, and the color that is overlaps, the color that overlaps with Abuja is gray, meaning that it is deeper, groundwater is deeper. But if you go to the coastal areas, the groundwater is shallower. In some parts of the Niger Delta, groundwater is about 2 feet from the ground surface. There are implications on this. Certain implications like the ease with which the groundwater can be contaminated is also related to this map. Any place that you see blue there, it means that groundwater can easily be contaminated because the vital zone is shallow. The vital zone is shallow. Contaminants can get in quite easy. Okay, I notice that time is going very fast, so I will accelerate. I mentioned that in those places, groundwater can get very can get accessible. I have drawn this diagram here to imply, to show, illustrate what I mean. You see, there you have waste that is on the ground surface. When it rains, as would be the case in places where global climate change makes rainfall intensity be very high. So what you will have is leaching of that waste, so that you have that red thing I have indicated there, pass through the vital zone into groundwater and then show up in a stream. And there are many scenarios like this in the developing world, where people use surface water for domestic purposes. In many places, those streams are being contaminated because of the flow of groundwater that is contaminated, and they may not even realize it because the ground is not transparent. So I drew this to illustrate that. Now, this is another example that I often show in developing countries of how the flooding of culverts, the flooding of stream beds, the flooding of depressions leach contaminants into groundwater, and those who have boreholes take them into their tanks, as I've illustrated there, and use this borehole water without cleaning it, and taking a lot of contaminants. And it's a contributor to the low life expectancy of some places in the developing world. It is not the only thing that is responsible for that. There are many factors, but contaminant intake is one of them. And there could be many of these contaminants. I have classified them here. These are normal products that are used in the developing world. Antifreeze, methanol, all of these drain into groundwater, and some of them are cancer causing, unfortunately. What about global climate change impacts such as droughts and water scarcity? I'll run through this because I want to go to the adaptation part of this and rush through it. You have seen this kind of a landscape. This is desertification. This is caused by drought, long periods without rainfall. This is one of the reasons that the Sahel is considered to be an area that is going to be impacted for many years to come. Not just the Sahel. We can also look at other parts of the world. I mean, Southern Africa has the Kalahari Desert, and that looks like this as well. Many other deserts in the world, even the southwestern part of the United States, some parts look like this as well, the desert parts. Now, West Africa, you see there, on the right-hand side, I am showing you the NASA map. As a result of global climate change, there is a whole lot of dust now moving in very large quantities across the ocean. Where you see this on the right-hand side, this is Senegal is somewhere out here, Mauritania is somewhere out here, Mali is somewhere out here. So that area, which also hosts the Sahara Desert, some areas of the Sahara Desert. What you see there is dust traveling out from that West African segment across the Atlantic Ocean on its way to North America. And so this confirms what I was telling you earlier, that the impacts of global climate change may be intense in one area, but it can also be transferred to other areas. This dust that I'm just pointing to has been traced to the Everglades in Florida in the United States. They will take some contaminants there. They will take some microbes to which the vegetation of the Everglades is not resistant. So these kinds of things happen and will continue to happen. This is the process by which that happens. The soil loses water and then cakes up and cracks, and then portions are formed of dust, and those dusts are airborne, and then they get into the atmosphere and travel. Some of them that are heavy will fall out of the air, but wind will take some to very distant places. It's a common phenomena that is global at this time. Health impacts, which is the concern. There will be a lot of heat strokes in many parts of the world. I wish I had time to spend on this. I don't, but suffice it to say that one of the impacts of global climate change will be excessive heat. And in many parts of the world, it will be unbearable, and mitigative actions or adaptation actions will have to be taken. And heat has various classification systems. If one, we have what we call the heat index chart, where temperature and time overlap. So where you have high temperature over a very long time, it could be fatal, as you see in that red portion. And some could result in severe stress at the laser regime, and then the stress part and the mild stress part. I have talked about mosquitoes and so forth. So let's go to mitigation, because I don't think we have so much time. What you see here is the kind of thing I was mentioning before, that the generation of dust because of drought in many parts of Africa, many parts of Southeast Asia, where the climate is very warm and dry in some respects, in some seasons. So you have a lot of dust. In my own opinion, dust is one of the greatest impairment mechanisms for human health in the developing world. You inhale dust and it gets into your bloodstream. Unfortunately, the dust bears some contaminants that may result in chronic diseases. Sometimes you have acute response, but even worse is the chronic response that will not be seen until many, many, many years later. Adaptation. What are the instruments of global climate change adaptation? I will just go through this quickly because I may take 5 to 10 minutes beyond my time to deal with this aspect. I did this for the Federal Ministry of Environment, so you may see this, but it applies to many other parts, many other countries. It doesn't necessarily have to be Nigeria's Ministry of Environment. So any adaptation program that is complete must have these elements. It must have the data collection aspect. In fact, establishment of regional environmental monitoring centers. A country like this or any other country should have regional centers for monitoring these impacts, collecting data on many, many, many ecological parameters. So that's a sub-program that must by necessity be one. Then you have to also develop some sort of biennial state of the environment report. This country, Nigeria, does not have it. I don't think any African country actually has it. Some Southeast Asian countries have it. I know that Malaysia has it. I know that Indonesia has it. But some of these other countries don't have them. You ought to be able to have a biennial. That's every 2 years you develop a report on your environment, what has happened in different places with coordinates. That's how you will be able to intervene where there have been negative impacts. Okay. The second sub-program is what I would call impact analysis. After you collect this data, what do these data mean? So there must be some sort of analytical system with the help of universities, with the help of non-profit groups, with the help of industrial research organizations and so forth, and be able to analyze them within the context of what does this mean to the energy system of your country? What does this mean to the water quality and water scarcity assessment of your country, or the agricultural initiatives of your country, housing, and all that? We've all seen those impacts. All of those impacts impact these sectors too, downstream. So you must have that. The third is that you must have a research and training sub-program. A research and training such program, because that's what will enable you to use the data in very unique ways, or even do interpolation in areas where you do not have data. You can extrapolate from where you have data to those areas in which data are sparse. We call that spatio-temporal analysis because often you have data scarcity for some areas. But it is research that enables you to develop the models, the technologies, the data systems, the data compilation system, the visualization systems that can be used to run society. And global climate change is not an exception. Now, so from that, then you go to policy development. When you have the other three, policy development could have integrity. But if it is just happenstance and using just common knowledge, a country such as this one or any of these developing countries is far too complex to use common sense to do things. It has to be analytical. It has to be systematic. It has to be strategic. And it has, in some cases, have to be tactical. Now, so then you have policy development. You have to train stakeholders. You have to do a process of public enlightenment and engagement on the climate change mitigation measures that have to be taken, and you also take community interest into consideration. The community, even though they are not experts, they have their aspirations, and those aspirations have to be polled in questionnaires and taken into consideration. Now, mitigation is not something we'll deal with today, but at least those four important elements, I'll just give some examples. For example, any country that has to develop in anything, be it for climate change adaptation, be it for agricultural production, be it for any of these sectors of sustainable development, the classification system for options of interception is usually the same, but the specifics may be different. So I personally classify intervention measures into these 7 categories. The first one is engineering. Technology runs the world. The difference between, say, the United States, between China these days, and a large part of the developing world is in the creation of systems to extract the intellect of their people, to create technological systems to deploy and solve problems. That is the difference between a technologically advanced country and one that is not. So engineering and technology is one. The second one is communication and education. The third is regulation, but regulations are always written in some sort of legal legis. So you have to get to enforcement and policies, right? Market incentives, okay? An example of market incentives, for example, in the mitigation part, not in the adaptation part, is incentives for people to migrate from using generators to using solar panels in their houses. We can say that the government may give some sort of incentives or give buyback mechanisms for generators. When you go, you bring a generator and they give you a solar panel and system. You see, that's an example of an incentive. Market incentives can be deployed to promote adaptation as well. I can name many examples. International intergovernmental cooperation. For example, if you have a city in Kenya and it's suffering from drought and there's a lot of air pollution there, and then next to that country is another country that has a city that has a similar problem. If that country in Kenya just wants to treat its own circumstance, it is useless. It means that the next country also has to do the same because the environment has no compartment. That boundary is only arbitrary. So things have to be done in such a case with international conventions and agreements to promote good behavior across boundaries. So that's international and intergovernmental cooperation. There are some examples there on the right-hand side. For example, in the area of implementation of engineering measures as an adaptation measure, you can have revegetation. Revegetation of a place that has lost a lot of vegetation because of droughts. Ground stabilization against erosion, windbreaks. There was going to be a major windbreaking across the Sahara, the southern fringes of the Sahara. It has remained as a plan for the past 15 years. They have not been able to do it. I do not know what is stopping them. They were going to have a windbreak across so as to catch the sand migration, the migration on sand dunes on the southern fringes of the Sahara into the Sahel. But that they've talked about that for a long time, and I believe Nigeria even has an agency for that, but nothing has happened. Let me say that I have developed a catalog, and I will not go through this because we don't have that much time. We started about 5 minutes late, so once it's 5 minutes, I'm cut off too. In agriculture, there are many adaptation systems that I have classified here. Okay, coverage of crops by shifting sands. We can deal with that through the use of windbreaks and dune stabilizers. If you go to the civil and industrial systems, you have disruption of energy supply. Okay, you have destruction of structures by storms and wind floods. You can improve the building code to make the building code more protective so that you will not have many structures fall apart because of windstorms. So there are many interventions that are of the engineering type. Some are just policy type, some are practice type, and some are just community education to take steps to protect themselves. Let's look at water resources. If you have a case in which you have increased erosion, you have salination. North African countries that are still developing countries have embarked on massive water desalination plants. A lot of those countries, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, have them. A lot of Middle Eastern countries also have them. United Arab Emirates. If you go to Dubai, if you go to Abu Dhabi, you'll see many water desalination plants there. In the health sector, increase in skin cancer, that one has to be dealt with by change in human behavior, limitation of exposure to the sun. These days, there are even balms that can protect the skin against those kinds of stresses. Increase in malaria cases, improvement in malaria control systems. Sometimes in some parts of the world, they are handing out nets. And there are many other places you can make sure you spray ponds with insecticides that kill malaria, provided that those insecticides are not ecologically toxic. And there are those that are being produced these days that are less toxic than the ones that used to be there. In the transportation sector, there are many of those as well. Also, one of the most important instruments to use in the developing world in global climate change adaptation is the use of environmental impact statements during the siting of facilities, industrial facilities, even big structures. If this place is in a place that we know will be susceptible to some of the stressors that could derive from global climate change, such as flooding, such as erosion, such as land settlement, such as mudslides, you can use the environmental impact process to demand the design of mitigation and adaptation systems. Maybe you raise the ground more before the building is put on there. Maybe you make sure that that building does not concentrate water currents anywhere, that the water will be led by pipes to a very far place where the soil is not as susceptible to erosion as at that site. So the process of environmental impact assessment that is typically employed in both the technologically advanced countries and the developing countries can be deployed as an adaptation mechanism. And it would work well because it will be less expensive. Then there is technology, monitoring technology. Much planning for adaptation cannot be done unless you have the data. These days, you just don't walk on the ground and get data. There are certain kinds of planning data that could be gotten by satellites. Like I have illustrated here, there are many satellites circulating with focus on the developing countries now. The whole idea is to have data that is spatially dense enough for use in planning purposes. You see, I put some grids here. We need data on even narrower grids than this, so that you can use that data and appreciate the circumstances in various regions of the developing world, and then construct appropriate design measures and intervention measures that could be classified as adaptation. And not just the case of having cables all around. You see, these are examples of the flight paths of some of those satellites that are focused on developing countries. See the ones that are focused on Africa, see the lines of flight. So I downloaded this from NASA, the US, and we have those now. So the whole idea is to be able to have spatial temporal data and use those data to plan for interventions that will improve the standard of living and the quality of life of people against all the stresses that will be induced by global climate change. Okay, I would not like to go much further so that you can ask questions. There are many, many more adaptation techniques I could project, but I'll wait until you ask me questions and I will respond to them in turn. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today on something that will affect everybody in every region of the world. Thank you very much. Oh, I cannot hear. Oh, you're mute. Please unmute. Unmute.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I got you. I got you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm sure a lot of us have gained from it. It's been very informative. And so we want to say thank you for the presentation. The questions and answers will come later, but we'll just take a few minutes break and show us a video on climate change. So that will be for a few minutes and then we'll continue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cooking is never a hobby for people like Mama Okpe. To her and other women in Okeiton, it's a hard job that has to be done. A typical day's meal starts with a long walk in search of firewood. In recent past, the trees used to be closer home, but because of lack of alternative fuel and the high cost of kerosene, Mama Okpe and the rest of the villagers have no other option than to decimate the nearest trees into firewood. And this has led to constant erosion in the area, encroaching desertification and long walks, all in the quest for a day's meal. Left to Mama Okpe, fetching the wood is not the problem. It's exposing her fragile lungs to the bad smoke that really gets her worried.
Bó ṣe máa ń wá ló ṣe máa ń lọ o. Ìgbà tí mo wà ní kékeré, ikọ́ ẹ̀ máa ń yọ mí, àbí ó máa ń yọ mí lẹ́nu gan. Àwọn dókítà wa ń wá ṣàyẹ̀wò, wọ́n ní kọ́ asthma ló ṣe mí. Àmọ́ àwọn aráàlú wọn ò gbàgbọ́, wọ́n lé mèrè ni mí. ó ní gbogbo mèrè tí wọ́n ń pẹ́ mèrè ò ṣe mèrè ọkọ mi ò gbàgbọ́ ọlọ́ọ̀lẹ̀ ni mí bẹ́ẹ̀ ọ̀lẹ tó ní mo yà yìí torí igi iná tí mò ń dá tẹ̀ fi ń fi mi òun ló fa gbogbo eléyìí fún mi òun ló fa gbogbo eléyìí fún mi ẹ wo obìnrin tó wà lọ́ọ̀kan ojú ẹ̀ bó ṣe wà yẹn ó ní àrùn ojú ń dùn nípasẹ̀ igi iná tó ń dá tẹ̀ fi ń fi lójú lójoojúmọ́ ọmọ kékeré ara mi gbogbo ẹwù mi gbogbo ẹwà mi ti sá gbogbo ọlọ́run kó ṣàánú mi ọ̀rọ̀ iná igi tí mò ń dá ló mú gbogbo ẹwà mi sá ọgbà tó bá yá nísìnyí ọkọ mi máa ló ń fẹ́ yàwó mi jẹ́ ń lọ wó mi lẹ́ǹkùlé.
Oh, finally, the food is ready and it's happy time for everyone, except Mamokwe. Who knows that her travails are never over? Every day, Mamokwe finds the strength to pick herself up, walk the mile, and cook the food. And yet, every day, cooking gets harder and harder for her and the other women. And no one is helping. While we were leaving Okeito, I tried to talk to Mamokwe about the impact of cutting trees on the climate and how because of it, Nigeria's future and the rest of the world's is threatened. And her response was,
a gbọ́dọ̀ wà láàyè igi ìdáná iná la kúkú gbọ́kànlé.
Time is running out. We need to save our environment and our mothers. They don't need to cook to die, they must cook to live. At Techno Oil, we have tried to reduce this suffering. And within a period of 2 years, we have distributed over 50,000 cylinders to 50,000 households in Nigeria. There are still 30 million Nigerians that are still suffering, still queuing, still destroying their environment just to cook. We might be old, but we need to prepare a better future for our next generation. We came up with the Techno Oil Cook Save initiative as a response to all these challenges. The unbearable cooking condition for mothers, the aggressive deforestation, and the worsening environment, among others. We knew that cooking gas is the solution, but the reality is we don't produce cylinders in Nigeria, we import them. Techno Oil will decided to build a cylinder manufacturing plant with an annual capacity of 5 million cylinders. And not just that, we are constructing a 15,000 metric ton LPG terminal. We have LPG skids in our filling station across the country, and then our ultra-modern bottling plant in place. What we need right now are partners that will help take these cylinders we've manufactured in Nigeria to over 30 million households in Nigeria.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting video, I must say. Even if you don't take away anything, you take away the fact that in spite of deforestation, which has an impact on climate change, we have mothers dying. And I like the part where she said our mothers don't need to cook to die. They need to cook to live. I think so. That's something I think we should take away. The impact of climate change is not just, it's also on our health and so several other things. Thank you so much for that video. We'll continue the program. Okay, so we're going to take a comment from Dr. Oladiran Fawidi. I'm happy to be here today because it's a long time I've seeing Dr. Fawibe. So for me, this is a reconnection. Dr. Fawibe is an astute and highly visionary chief executive officer. He holds a PhD in petroleum process economics from the University of Ibadan. He was awarded Doctor of Science in Petroleum Economics honoris causa by Marquis GS International University Foundation in 1990, and was also cited in Marquis Who is Who's in the World in 1997. He has also recently been awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by PITAN and cited in the second edition of the Who is Who in Nigerian Oil and Gas Industry, published by ODT. His work experience spans organizations and institutions like the Nigerian Institute of Social and Economic Research, NISER, and University of Nigeria, Ibadan, and the Central Bank of Nigeria, and the NNPC. So we'll ask Dr. Fawibe to give us his comments. Good to have you here, Dr. Fawibe.
Thank you so much. This is not an event for me. It is for Hillary, who has been very, very profound in educating all of us this morning. Thanks for the compliment and the citation you have just given. You see, like I said in my chat, each time I have the opportunity to listen to Professor Inyang, Hillary Inyang, or even read some of his writings, I used to be amazed at the kind of intellectual capacity he has displayed in providing information and analysis in details. The lecture of this morning has been very, very informative and impactful. So the one thing that struck me during the lecture, it has demonstrated the impact, of climate change in various parts of the world, and in particular our country, and more intimately the Niger Delta, where we are having a lot of problems. I was almost having the urge to cry, when I saw the video about the woman and some of the other women, and I just imagine that this is a woman who was born into this world, and the people were rejoicing when he was born. See the amount of problem she was going through, the flames of the fire that was burning from what she was doing. Now, the one thing I want to quickly mention is the point made by Prof about the what the developing countries could do in terms of adaptation or mitigation. I just feel that it will still be. I know he anchor his viewpoint on cost of mitigation, but I still feel that developing countries, instead of wasting resources on a number of things that are intangible, should also consider the issue of mitigation. Incidentally, our President Buhari, during his visit to Spain, from which he has just come back, also mentioned the issue of climate change, that developing countries and of course our country should join in the race, for global change emission. So what in effect I'm saying is that his recommendation should also include mitigation, not just adaptation. Prof, I think you can take that on. There are a number of things that one could talk about, but I just limit myself to this single point so that I will give the a chance to other people to make comment. But I thank you very much for recognizing me. And incidentally, Udeme Apan has been very forthright in bringing me on, because this is early morning in Houston, where I am. But because of the invitation, and also Professor Inyang being the lecturer, that I should be part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fawibi. We appreciate your comments. So we'll go back to, like I was saying, our environmental comrade, Mr. Nelson Wafo, the Executive Director of Foundation for Environmental Rights, Advocacy and Development. Mr. Nelson will have 10 minutes.
All right. Thank you for having me. Hello.
Hello, yes,
can you hear me?
Yes,
we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Prof, for such a very wonderful presentation. Personally, I have learned a lot of things about the climate change from the ones that I know already, and actually part of the issues that is on ground that actually have been affecting our environment. And one of my take home of that presentation is the issue of this adaptation. Climate change is already with us, and all we have to do is how do we adapt? What are the mitigation factors that we have on ground, so as to enable us continue to engage various stakeholders to ensure that our environment is being protected. I'm also concerned about Nigerian determined contributions that we had signed on, and believing that government will begin to speed up the process of its implementation to look at the issue of the greenhouse emissions. We look at the reducing carbon. We look at the issue of gas flaring and oil spill that have ravaged so many communities in the Niger Delta area. Then we looked at our ecosystem that have been destroyed by the effect of oil pollution and the exploitation by the multinational firms across the Niger Delta. So it is a time for us to see how do we going to mitigate all these issues. When are we going to end gas flaring in the Niger Delta? What is the government commitment to ensure that we protect our environment? And this is a part of what is ensuring in the national determined contribution. How do we improve our agriculture? How do we ensure that we have a smart agriculture? Then we empower local community women to be self-reliant, to involve into one agriculture process or the other, so as to make a form of a livelihood and also complement the effect of climate change. And the government also talked about reducing emission through introduction of the mass transit buses in the country. What is government doing towards that particular level, so that we can reduce the numbers of the vehicles on the road, and we can reduce the emissions that is going into the atmosphere? So this training or this workshop by Prof is very important, and it is very key, and it is a time for us as stakeholders to decide what are we going to do. How do we build the capacity of people to understand that climate change is already here with us? How do we mitigate these factors? How do we build the capacity of civil society groups and other stakeholders to ensure that we go to the communities, sensitize our people, build the capacity to respond to the issue of climate change? How do we ensure that government policies is working towards addressing the issue of climate change, like the issue of climate financing, the issue of budget for the climate change, budget to increase our agriculture, budget to ensure that we have a sustainable environment. So all these things are things that is very important that we need to look at, especially looking at actually the impact of climate change that has already come to stay with us. So Prof, I have already made all the whole presentations. We're just trying to make our own remarks to collaborate actually the whole presentation Prof have really made, especially the video that was played was very interesting, and it's also very educating. So it's a very good opportunity to be a part of this engagement, and I think we continue to collaborate, we continue to partner, we continue to use our resources and our networks to ensure that we build the capacity of community women, to ensure that they adapt to the issue of climate change. We engage government on the policy formulation, and then we ensure that all the stakeholders in the environment they work towards protecting a safer and a cleaner environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your intervention, and it was a very good one. We talked a lot about the Niger Delta, from Prof to Dr. Fawibe to Mr. Nelson. So we're just going to call Mr. Fineface Dumnamene, who lives in the Niger Delta, to just share his experience or comment. Just give us a few comments. 2 minutes, please. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'm glad to be part of this program. And you know, the way we have One Earth as the theme of this year's World Earth Day is the way I would say that One Earth, no matter how it is so large, so complex, and it's something that we have to continue to learn about every day of our lives. I have learned so much from Prof this morning. His presentation wasn't only detailed, but also has a lot of graphics that explains to everyone what we currently face in relation to climate change in our One Earth that we all live in. So I think that such materials is something that everyone needs to learn and get to learn about and contribute from their own perspective to see how we can all collectively work towards One Earth, devoid of the problem that we currently have. The issue of climate change is not something we can say that it's a Western something or Sub-Saharan African something. It's something that affects all of us everywhere in the world. And environment is said to be the first right of man. And if you want to destroy a man, you just destroy the man's environment and you would have destroyed the man. That is why in the Niger Delta region today, where you have massive environmental pollution going on, gas flaring going on, being contributed to by youths involved in artisanal crude oil refining and oil theft, and the multinational oil companies that are polluting this area, they may think that they are only destroying the Niger Delta, but they wouldn't know that the destruction they are putting on ground here will also affect them in their home countries, especially those who are not from here that are involved in this unwholesome practice. So I think we all have to put our hands on deck and contribute to efforts that we mitigate the climate change problem we have that is affecting our world. By so doing, we can have something to leave behind for generations yet unborn, because if we don't sustain the environment, making it better from what we currently have, then we would have destroyed what we inherited. And I don't know what we are going to hand over to the next generation of people that are yet unborn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dumnamene. We appreciate your intervention. Right now, we're going to be taking a few questions and then comments, but I am sure Professor Yang has seen one of the comments by Godswill Odiong. I think he should just start from there and then maybe respond to Dr. Fawibe on adaptation and mitigation. Godswill Odiong was asking, he said, as COVID-19 proved the hardest hit to those who are already vulnerable and marginalized, climate crisis is no different. He now asked, where do we go from here? Do we see any glimpses of a new world order emerging out of this chaos? So, Prof, I would like you to take that question and also respond to Dr. Fawibe.
Thank you very much, moderator, for your very excellent handling of this. The first question, which is where do we go from here, considering that we now have a double whammy? That is, you have COVID-19 and you also have global climate change issues all intermingled now. What has happened? I really would like to indicate what has happened from my current engagement in some African countries and beyond. A lot of countries had developed their own national plans, that is, national socioeconomic plans. Nigeria has its own too. These are typical 5-year plans. Well, because of COVID-19, the money that they thought, the national revenues that they thought they were going to have, they didn't quite have because of economic slowdown. So they are having to reorganize those national development plans. An example is South Africa, a country that I'm involved with very deeply in their national programs. So the question is, what is now going to happen? Those countries that are very dynamic are going to alter their plans to accommodate the shortfall in revenue or divert things to other areas that are more expedient. Other countries that cannot do that will suffer somewhat. South Africa now has a very big program that they are just initiating. I am the international reviewer of that. It is called the South African Nutrition and Food Security Program, which is a direct response to the shortfalls of COVID-19, coupled with the impacts of global climate change. They are looking at various areas of the country, that various provinces, to look at what food budgets do they have, what are the hazards to food insecurity to various populations in different villages and so forth. So that's what needs to be done by a Nigeria. That's what needs to be done by a Senegal or an Ethiopia if the conflicts allow. So these are the things that should happen. So asking me what is likely to happen, it will depend on the dynamism of each government and what they would plan to do to adjust to the reality of the combination of COVID-19 hazards and the global climate change impacts that they are experiencing. So those changes would have to be done in the agricultural sector to impact upon food security, to deal with occupational changes, to deal with impacts of global climate change and degradation of some ecosystems. If people were fishermen, they may not need to be again, they may need to shift. On the types of ecological things that are done, environmental protection things, building standards and codes for strengthening structures against flooding, more culverts, better construction mechanisms for roadways so they are not washed off, erosion control in some parts, for example, Eastern Nigeria and Western Nigeria and Central Nigeria. So these are the kinds of changes that need to be done. The second question, I believe, was on mitigation versus adaptation. Developing countries are focused mostly on adaptation because they did not have the wherewithal to control. In order to do mitigation, there's a lot of investment. For example, the United States, one in which I was involved, to do mitigation there's a whole lot of energy portfolio standards in various states where the states are told, okay, 30% of your energy system needs to be renewable energy. Okay, so a lot of states, they have such rules, but that means a lot of investment to change from coal burning power plants to solar power, change to wind aided power and nuclear power, all of that. But most of these developing countries don't have the investment climate or don't have the resources to do that at a very large scale. So this is the problem. In order to do that, to emphasize mitigation as well, these countries need loans. They need access to capital. They can generate some within their countries, but they may not be able to generate as much as needed to embark on wholesale mitigation. Although they have signed all those agreements, COP21 and now the one that is coming up in Egypt very soon. So this is why a lot of these countries are trying to favor adaptation. Although I do agree with my brother that adaptation alone is not enough. A big country like Nigeria has to deal with the issue of gas flaring. For more than 25 years, I have seen all kinds of intentions declared that gas flaring will stop or at least reduce to reasonable levels, but that has not happened. Nigeria has to figure out a way of using the gas to create more energy efficient power plants and so forth. So I'll stop there unless there are additional questions.
Okay, I see Dr. Faride's hand up. Do you have something to say?
Yes, thank you very much, moderator. The issue, I've listened to the comments of Prof, and he was right in terms of the limited resources available to developing countries. My viewpoint when I made that suggestion is that prevention is better than cure. Now, there are little things we could do to shade the narrative. When we look at zeroing on Nigeria and Niger Delta in particular, everybody is appalled with the level of pollution going on there, self-inflicted pollution by the people in terms of, say, oil theft, illegal refining, and so on, and the failure of government to stop gas flaring. Recently, there was couple of years ago, there was an attempt to do commercialization of gas flaring in the country, but nothing came out of it. I won't come to the open forum to say some of the things that actually transpired where the exercise was not too successful. These are some of the things. So I'm just wondering whether, and we have Ministry of Environment, not only at the federal level, but also at the state level. And not much impact has been made, through the activities of these various ministries, which in effect means that government itself, may not be too effective. Even though we look up to government, there's a lot of frustration, and I know that Professor Inyang, who has been involved, based on what he said, has been involved in South Africa activities. I know when I met him some years ago, we exchanged ideas about what our country should be doing and the effect that and the change he could introduce. And he told me a lot of things that he has suggestion he has provided, to our authorities in Nigeria. I don't know how much of involvement is having, and many people who actually have expertise to help this country, at times they don't. They are frustrated. But I'm now wondering, last suggestion I want to make is that can we start to have volunteers, either in form of NGO or in one form or the other, volunteers that will sensitize the people, especially in the Niger Delta, about this issue of environment, that will make a change to stop our people from causing problems, the type that we saw in the video that was played during this presentation. I think we should look at how we could form volunteer group across the length and breadth of, if not in Nigeria, but even Niger Delta, to stop some of the issues, some of the problems being caused for our people, and that making them to die, by installment. So this is one suggestion I want to make. Thank you.
Yes. Moderator, I would like to add something there. Hello?
Okay, sir, but quickly. Thank you.
Okay. Because my brother was talking about social change, because this will actually need social change to be, the government is part of that. I would like to mention 4 particular entities that must be part of that before things can change. Because for about 25 years, I was advisor to the Nigerian Senate on environmental matters from outside, from the US. Unfortunately, not much happened. So I need to reveal this to the public, that to have something happen, there are these entities that must become more responsible for management of Nigeria's environmental issues. Number one, the Senate Committee on Environment, because it is the committee that is prime in its control of the Nigerian National Environmental Fund. That environmental fund, the Ecological Fund, Office of Nigeria. That's one. Second, the Ministry of Environment. Third, NOSDRA, because it has supremacy over some things. I myself was the primary idea behind the creation of NOSDRA in 2004, many years ago. And then there's NESRIA. So as long as these three or four organizations get together and decide to be more effective, then you can have gas flaring reduced. Maybe they can get the Ministry of Energy and Power to intervene as well, because they have to use the gas. They can't stop gas flaring without having an alternative for the gas. So these are all intertwined issues that those entities must be more serious about before Nigerians can be saved from all of the risk, the health risk that it now suffers in the area of gas flaring.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that great intervention. Before we do the closing, I want to call the organizers. They have something interesting to say, so I'll let them say themselves. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate your presence at this very epoch-making meeting. Also, we want to thank, from the bottom of our hearts, Professor Hilary Inyang. You've given us a very rare dimension to the issue of climate change. Thank you for this exceptional, breathtaking presentation. We really appreciate you. And from the organizers, we'd like to present this certificate of appreciation, the digital version. We shall make the physical version available, and I'll get it across to you in due course. So please, I want us to help me put your hands together as we appreciate this dynamo, this erudite scholar, this icon of our time, for this awesome presentation. Professor, we really thank you. So this is display of the certificate. Please, can we put our hands together for Prof?
Well, look at the give me certificate.
Appreciation.
Guys, thank you very much for this beautiful certificate. I've just seen it.
We thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. The certificate is so beautiful. Congratulations.
Very beautiful certificate.
The lecture.
Thank you.
And yeah, on that note, we want to appreciate the professor for his presentation. We want to thank Dr. Fawibe. We want to thank Mr. Nelson Nwafo, Mr. Fineface, Tumna Mene, and everyone who attended. We appreciate you. We may not have called your name, but we know you are valuable and you have contributed by being present here, because as we are here, we will tell each other what we have heard here, and so we'll make our own impact. So we want to say thank you. I want to also tell everyone that the meeting is recorded and the link will be made available in the daily media, social media platforms. So if you go there, you'll find this recording. We want to thank even the organizers, because if you don't organize this, some of the things we've talked about, you won't be able to do it. So we want to say thank you so much, everybody, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you all. Very much. We appreciate
thank you very much. Thank you very much. I will make this document available to the organizers so it can be downloaded.
Okay, we appreciate that, sir.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Nelson. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
The contribution, sir.